Welcome to the People's History of Horror. My name is Aaron.
And I'm Mike.
And this is our first podcast. And when I say first podcast, I mean this is literally the first podcast we've ever made. So we are not experts in this field. And we plan to improve on all of this and get better, but this is what we got for you this time.
We are professional fans, otherwise known as amateurs. So, here we go.
Mm-hmm. And so, we do love horror, and specifically film and literature, and that's what we plan on discussing and analyzing in this podcast. We know a lot about it, but we want to learn more and use what we already know to get, better at learning more about it, I suppose.
And there's already so many experts with their videos out there about it, so why not have a point of view from the fans, a people's history of horror?
And that's what this is basically going to be. We want to just kind of analyze horror from the bottom up, so to speak, as fans and lovers of horrors, and not necessarily academics and experts and, analysts, but just people.
With that being said, we do feel like we know our shit.
And that shit that we love and know so much is horror. And really what we want to do here is analyze horror. And that's all of horror, the ins and outs, whether it be the politics behind it, the psychology, the historical relevance of what was happening in that time period. Kind of like Godzilla is just a movie about a bomb that killed a bunch of people.
Now, when we discuss horror, we're not focusing on just horror movies or books. We're encompassing anything. Horrors, obviously, we're going to start with novels. That's the beginning, the stories. Great movies have come from that, and new original ideas because of that. We'll discuss those. We're going to discuss probably some comic books at some point. There's a lot of horror in those. Anything you can think of that horror has influenced will probably come up.
Oh yeah, we're definitely going to cover comic books and TV and really like you said, anything that, even as far back as old folklore and mythology. There's a lot of horror in there I'm sure we can touch on. Medusa, basically the entire story of Beowulf. There's a lot to cover in there. And it's not just in horror, but there's horror and sci-fi and fantasy that I'm sure we can touch on.
Who can deny that horror and comedy, one of the greatest duos?
Yeah, that's a whole subject we can definitely dive into. And one thing that I did want to bring up that we could discuss is real life history. There's horrific moments in history that should be analyzed much in the same way, just because of what it's done to our culture. For example, the Jack the Ripper. That's definitely a horrific story. He's become like a folk legend in that way.
Life is terrifying.
Yeah. And so I feel like that there's a lot of areas that we can touch on and that we kind of should touch on. And so the idea to start out here, we came up with a reading list to analyze one Stephen King, the so-called king of horror, which we will be covering at length in various ways.
But he's the king for a reason.
Yeah. And so the idea being that Stephen King in particular is a good subject to start with, and that he's been writing over 4 decades, nearly 50 years of material to work from, so he has a wide breadth throughout the history of horror, and he was inspired by all the stuff that came before him. And his non-fiction book, Danse Macabre, covers a lot of that, which we will get into. My blog covers a lot of that, which we could read from in another episode. But now I would just like to read off of our official reading list. So this is the list that y'all would be reading along with. And so I'm going to just go ahead and read it off now. It's Salem's Lot.
Absolutely terrifying.
The Dark Tower 1, The Gunslinger. The Stand. Dark Tower 2, The Drawing of the Three. Then 2 short stories from the collection Night Shift, those being Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road.
They go with Salem's Lot.
Yeah, they kind of sandwich Salem's Lot there, a prequel and a sequel. Eyes of the Dragon.
Side note on Eyes of the Dragon, if you're trying to get one of your children or niece or nephew or little cousin into King, and they like fantasy, but they're kind of young, you don't know about horror for them yet, highly recommend Eyes of the Dragon to start. That's what my nephew starting with. He's 11, and he's loving it.
Next we'll go to The Talisman. And then The Dark Tower 3, The Wastelands. Then a short story from the collection Skeleton Crew. Quite a popular short story entitled The Mist. And then we'll be rounding out the year, I suppose, of 2024. Probably, I don't know. With probably, if not the, one of the best known Stephen King novels, known as It. And then we'll be following that up with the first and one of the other well-known ones, Carrie. And then, again, one of the well-known ones, The Shining. And then we'll go to some lesser-known ones. Insomnia, one of my favorites. Rose Madder. Then we'll be coming back to the Dark Tower series with Wizard and Glass, the 4th installment. And then these next 2 are kind of sister novels in a weird way.
Twinners, if you will.
We'll get into that when we get to it. And those are Desperation and The Regulators, which he wrote under the name Richard Bachman. And then after that, Hearts in Atlantis. And then we'll be getting into 2 more short stories from the collection titled Everything's Eventual. And one of the stories is also entitled Everything's Eventual, and the other one being The Little Sisters of Illyria, which is a prequel to The Gunslinger. And then we'll be going to Castle Rock with Needful Things.
One of my absolute favorites.
And then we'll be going on an adventure with a little girl and Firestarter. It's quite a fiery novel. Lol. Bag of Bones will be coming up next. And then The Dark Tower 5, Wolves of the Kala.
Surprisingly, not really about werewolves.
And then Duma Key, one of the lesser known of Stephen King's works, but quite a good novel.
And I know nothing about it yet.
And then we'll be going to Black House. And then From a Buick 8. And after that, back to the Dark Tower with the 6th installment, Song of Susanna. And then we'll be going Under the Dome with Stephen King's Simpsons ripoff. And we'll be going back in time with 11/22/63. And if you know that date, then you can put together what that book is about.
Mind-blowing book.
And then we'll be following that up with the 7th installment, the last Dark Tower book, The Dark Tower. And then we'll be following those up with Dr. Sleep. And then a fun little trilogy of books, Gwendy's Button Box, Gwendy's Magic Feather, and Gwendy's Final Task.
Otherwise known as the Gwendy Trilogy. Very fitting.
And then we're going to do something a little different and move along to Stephen King's son, Joe Hill, with his novel Nosferatu. Quite good. And then the last one on this list is the middle Dark Tower books, 4.5, if you will, Wind Through the Keyhole.
Now, this reading list, we came up with this because we're such fans of King and the Dark Tower, specifically. And these are the Dark Tower and tie-ins in different ways, and books we feel are important. That's a lot of King. We understand that. So we're going to have other books spread in here and there throughout to break it up a little.
Short stories here
You'll
and
hear
there.
some short stories. You'll hear some classics. All sorts of things sprinkled in throughout to have little breaks in. And we'll keep you updated when that's happening.
And so another reason that Stephen King is the general theme of this horror podcast would be is that he is genuinely one of both of our favorite writers, and he is genuinely one of the masters of horror. Pretty much any list of horror masters is definitely going to include him, if not have him at the very top. He's a cultural icon for that at this point.
And he's a big part of the reason we love horror.
Yeah. And so I figured we'd kind of discuss that, like where we came from as far as being fans of horror. And mine really goes back to the early 90s with the Tales from the Crypt TV show. That was really my first exposure to horror as a kid, and it interested me even though I wasn't really supposed to be watching it. I remember sneaking into the living room while my mom was watching it late at night and hiding behind the couch so I could get a glimpse of the Crypt Keeper. And from there, I enjoyed those little seek and find books where you try to find the monster in the crowd of monsters. I talk about all of this in my blog. I go in detail about why those really interested me, what about those, made me stick to horror, like what about it I found so intriguing. And a big part of it is that it's always kind of been taboo. You're not really supposed to like it. Like, people who like that stuff are weird, and I guess that kind of thing has always just interested me. So when I was older and really interested in reading and everything, it didn't really take me long to find Stephen King. I had seen his name all over books in the bookstore and all of these movies. Like, I'm sure everyone remembers the TV version of It, the TV version of The Stand. Those were staples on TV, and so they were always there. And Halloween franchise always interested me. And so, yeah, like, once I did get to Stephen King, like, I read the first book of his that I read was It. And that classic black cover with the red lettering and the creepy little alien claw sticking up out of the gutter, like, that immediately grabbed my attention, and I read that book. And being that I was like 11 when I read that, and it still only took me like a week or two to read over 1,000 pages of quite graphic fiction, yeah, like from there, like, I was pretty much like, all right, this is my shit, like, this is what I like. And from there I read Pet Sematary and started reading all of the books that I could find of his, and pretty much anything he's come out with since then I've had my hands on as soon as I could. And so, yeah, it's easy for me to freely join in any kind of Stephen King reading fan club, blah blah blah, whatever, but I just think he's more important than just a really good horror writer. Like, he's a good writer in general, and we can mention, he's written a lot more than just horror, but he's definitely a master of horror. But he also inspired me to go read some of the more classic books like Dracula and H.P. Lovecraft's work. And, like, we'll get to our favorites here in a minute where a lot of that comes up, but it's really Stephen King that got me into the other stuff that, I've tried. It's pretty much everything else on the list. If it's not him, it's something that he inspired me to to go check out.
Most horror tropes that you can think of, King did it and did it well.
Yeah.
So my introduction to horror, I mean, I'm gonna be honest. I feel like I was kind of brainwashed, cult style in it. You know, my mother is just such a horror fanatic, and my older sister and I are just like her in regards to that. So is actually my little sister. Really, all four of us kids are. It's ridiculous. But I mean, at a young age, my parents were honestly
Spooky.
we didn't really. They didn't hold us back from watching anything hardly, other than if it was just a lot of nudity and sex and like that. Then no, we couldn't watch it. But horror, gore, violence, it was all go. And unless you had nightmares about it, and then you just didn't tell them. So, I mean, from an early age, we would, a lot of things you brought up. We'd watch Tales from the Crypt with my mom at night. She was such a King fan that any Stephen King adaptation came on and we watched it. I knew all of them, and that was before I really started reading. I didn't consider myself much of a reader. When I did get a little older in school, I had to read more, obviously, and got to pick and choose what I read more instead of just assignments. And that's when, obviously, I went to my love for Tolkien, but I gravitated straight to King. I wanted to read It. That was the first one to draw me in because of how much I loved the miniseries. And I looked at it. Oh, I'm sorry.
I noticed that a lot, that a lot of King fans, we're both fans of Mike's Books reviews on YouTube, and that was his first one.
Great channel, by the way. You should check them out.
And then there's there's another Stephen King podcast. I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but that guy's first book was also It. And I find that tends to be a trend, at least in our generation of people, that It is really their first King book or their first King exposure. And I've just always found that interesting.
Yeah, well, it wasn't my first book. I wanted it to be, and it was fucking massive. And so I was like, I always loved Misery. So I went and got Misery, and I read it first. And I read Misery, and then I read It. And then I believe it was The Shining, and then Pet Sematary, something like that. But I read about 5 or 6 King books in a row because that's all she wrote, man. I love them. Yeah. And then, at that point, I'd already read Dracula, Frankenstein, some of the classics. I always loved horror. But I saw on the shelf one day at the library, I wanted something Stephen King, something I hadn't read. I'd already read The Stand at this point, a lot of the big ones. And I see The Drawing of the Three. Now, I hadn't read The Gunslinger, and I didn't know anything about the Dark Tower at all. Didn't know it was a thing. I just checked this book out, and I'm telling you, by chapter 2, I was in. I loved it. It just carried me away. It got me super excited, and as soon as I finished it, I went back to the library, and I checked out The Gunslinger, and I knew I had to go on this journey. It was amazing. But, no, my love of horror is, obviously, Aaron's the book guy. He knows books way better than I do. Don't let me fool you. Now, movies, that's my jam.
You probably got me on the movies.
I watch horror all day long if I could, and I have my whole life. I love it. My hero as a child, as fucked up as this is Freddy Krueger, man. That guy was amazing. I love Nightmare on Elm Street. Again, I can blame my mother. She got me into all the slashers. Those are my favorites. So, I mean, we're talking horror. You can't talk horror without bringing up Michael Myers and Freddy and Jason and Leatherface. But you also got to give appreciation to guys like Ghostface and Scream, what they did, where they can turn it, they kind of let you laugh at horror. You would never got horror parodies without those guys.
I like Scream because as far as the franchise of Scream, it is unique in the sense that it's the first one that isn't based around a specific killer, but instead around a specific group of survivors.
Yeah.
In the sense where each movie is a different killer, but the same group of...
dealing with that shit.
Dealing with the killers. Whereas every other franchise is built around the villain, and you have a new crop of victims for each movie.
Most horror franchises it's focused on the killer, where this one is focused on the unluckiest group of friends ever.
Yeah. And it really did, like, and I like how that franchise really does play up the whole Scooby-Doo effect of
making fun of itself.
Yeah.
Now, are you just saying that because of Matthew Lillard?
No, well, I mean, that's just a bit of irony. No, the reason I'm saying is because it is, who's under the mask. It's a group of friends who are investigating a series of, murders in this case. So Scooby-Doo hardly or never really dealt with murders, but you get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It has a very Scooby-Doo feel to it, but it keeps the
turned it on its head,
of,
but still kept it scary.
Mm-hmm, it definitely kept it scary for what it is, and it's unique in a lot of ways where it successfully makes fun of itself while it's scaring you at the same time. Like, that's a hard effect to pull off. Like, you can have comedy and horror together, but really Scream and I would say Evil Dead are really the only ones that can effectively scare you while they're making you laugh at the same time, like with one scene or act.
They're the only thing that is still the only ones I can think of. I'm sure I'll think of more that are still terrifying. They're still doing their job while still making you laugh, and not only that, but they're still terrifying while making fun of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just love
Nightmare
horror.
on Elm Street has a tint of that, but it's usually separated where the jokes are there for comic relief as opposed to...
I feel like he does that because the teens just don't know how to handle that. Like, think about it. You're in the most terrifying situation, and they're not the ones being funny. It's only him. He's just fucking with them even more. That's why Freddy's my guy, though. That dude, he's a beast.
Chucky has a similar effect. He's more menacing about it, whereas Freddy's he's having fun.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there's several.
I guess we'll go ahead and let the audience get to know us a little more by talking about our favorite horror stuff specifically. And so we'll start with the books. I'm going to just start naming some off. And so one that's on this list here in front of me that a lot of people wouldn't even put into a list of horror novels is Jurassic Park.
Man, read it.
Yeah, it's clearly horrifying, and it's mainly science fiction, or as Michael Crichton called them, techno thrillers. But
think about it, being chased down by dinosaurs.
Yeah, I mean, it is a scary.
That's pretty horrifying. That's horror to me.
And it's also like corporate mishandling of really serious shit, And so
it's nonfiction.
Yeah. And then Clive Barker definitely should be mentioned in any kind of horror master list. And so I got a couple of his on here. Imagica, which is probably my favorite out of what he's done. Other than that, Weave World is. Those two kind of compete with each other as like his best in my mind. Most people know him mostly as from the Hellbound Heart, which is what the movie Hellraiser is made from. And so, like, that's where he really made his. And then Dean Koontz is another one that people want to bring up anytime you bring up Stephen King.
Well, I mean, he's the knockoff king, man. He's not as good. He's still good.
Yeah, I got a couple of his on here. So Twilight Eyes is definitely I like the whole carnival scene type of like Ray Bradbury feel that he has going on in there, and there's some spooky stuff in there. Then of course you got to mention some classics that are just gonna get Ray Bradbury. I just mentioned, so there you go. But I was thinking a little older than that. So we had mentioned Dracula before, and the vampires get mentioned. You're gonna mention Dracula. So
Dracula and Frankenstein.
If you're Frankenstein.
If you're a horror fan, those are must reads. I mean, they're classics for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
They're those were honestly some of the first horror stories I read. I remember checking them out from the school library in like 6th grade.
Yeah. And I mentioned in my blog that not only is Frankenstein one of the early horror stories, but it's also she created the science fiction genre with that, and most people don't recognize that. But obviously other classics would include Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then you got like War of the Worlds is more sci-fi, but like there's of course the back in the day Orson Welles started reading it on the radio and it caused a whole, like, everyone's heard that story, and so I guess War of the Worlds can be terrifying if you're, but
I don't know. I mean, I think of science fiction more than horror for that one myself, but I can see it though.
It's definitely on the cusp of that.
You got to include Exorcist. I mean, everyone thinks of the movie, of course, but it
was a great book too.
An amazing book, and the sequel to it, Legion.
Mm-hmm.
Like
those are William Peter Blatty. He was a great writer. Then, of course, we mentioned King, so we might as well throw some King novels in there. So we got Salem's Lot, The Stand, and It on here specifically. So
Pet Sematary as well. That's another.
Pet Sematary is also on here. Yes.
All right.
But I mentioned The Stand, and when you're talking about that kind of story, you also should, in my opinion, bring up Robert McCammon's Swan Song, which they're very similar books, but obviously like the end of the world situation. But there's a specific difference in where in The Stand the problem is a medical issue, and in Swan Song it's a political issue. So there's obviously The Stand kind of regained a little bit of popularity recently with our own little plague-like situation.
Captain Trips in real life.
And if you're going to mention King, we should bring up his son again, Joe Hill, with Nosferatu, which was on the list previously. But he also has a couple of other good ones. Horns, that was made into a good movie with Daniel Radcliffe, actually. And then his original one is Heart-Shaped Box. It's a very interesting take on the ghost story.
Didn't he actually write a book, Ghost Stories?
No, it's a collection of short fiction called 20th Century Ghost Stories. Or those 20th Century Ghosts. I don't even know. Yeah.
So, we talked about books. Let's talk movies, man.
Yeah.
Like, first of all, you already know me, and I've already made it clear, I think. Nightmare on Elm Street's going up there right off top. The slashers, the big three are going. Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Friday the 13th.
Yeah, I mentioned Halloween earlier. Halloween's definitely
you know, you think of those immediately with horror. But one of the greatest horror films of all time, The Exorcist, just like the book. Everyone thinks of The Exorcist when they think of horror. I mean, it's a classic, and it's truly a terrifying film, you know? And, of course, just like the books, Dracula, there's been so many.
Yeah, that's so good.
So many are not good, but they're good in their own way.
Mm-hmm. Same thing with
Sorry.
Frankenstein, for that matter.
Yeah, and a lot of werewolf films. Like, there's a lot of duds out there, but, you know, hey, just go watch Silver Bullet.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's that whole idea of the trio with Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Wolfman, or whatever, werewolves. There's always Van Helsing, the movie, which isn't technically a horror movie, but
it's a great film. Just watch it.
Yeah, I would recommend that at any time. So,
but if we're talking horror recommendations, I mean, absolutely, number one, The Thing. John Carpenter is the man.
Anything that John Carpenter did,
pretty much.
Yeah,
I'll put him up there with Wes Craven, if you know.
Yeah, I would definitely put The Thing. He did a good job with Christine, for that matter. Speaking of King.
Yeah, yes, he did. And man, Salem's Lot, because we just brought up vampires. Salem's Lot was terrifying as a child, man. Danny Glick in the window. Oh.
And I mean, like we mentioned earlier with It and The Stand, pretty much any Stephen King adaptation is good if you like King, and then there's the ones that are actually good movies. But if you're like a hardcore fan like me, you've seen all of them, so yeah. Any of them are enjoyable now, just for like nostalgic taste.
Yeah, and I mean we're throwing a lot of old stuff out, but a little newer. I mean, The Conjuring.
That whole.
There's one or two of them in there. I personally don't really care that much.
We could
for,
say the same thing with Halloween and Jason.
But all in all, The Conjuring are great films.
I liked the Witch. And
The
Vivitch and
It Comes at Night was good too. Not as good, but it was really good.
And then we should just throw out the Babadook just because it did. And what's the new one that has a similar weird name? Skinamarink. I haven't seen that yet.
I actually saw that, and is
it good?
Terrible.
Is it okay?
No, never mind. Never mind. I haven't watched that one. I'm mixing it up with another random one I found called Grimcutty. Yeah, like see.
Yeah, no, I haven't heard of that one, but I'll have
if
to
you
check
see
it out.
Skip it.
Oh, okay. Well, Skinamarink is a good one, or you haven't?
I haven't seen that one. I plan to. I just haven't.
Yeah,
and Scream. We didn't even bring up Scream. Scream
we,
is so great.
We mentioned Scream earlier, and
true.
we definitely should throw Scream out there again. It's like that's like what the top.
They're so fun.
Slashers from the 90s.
Oh
anyways.
yeah, that's 90s slasher. That's 90s horror to a T.
But as long as we're talking about new things, how do you feel about Jordan Peele's
Get Out?
Or just, I was just going to say his
all of them?
Yeah.
They're great.
Yeah.
I love them. I literally watched Us like 2 days ago, just randomly. Like I come in and my sister was watching it, and I was like, "Hey, restart that." Me and you went and saw Nope like 2 times, 3 times.
It was at least
twice. Like 4 different people to see it. The movie's great. Twice. Yeah, he's doing great, man. He needs to keep it up. All right, so I mean we've talked about great horror movies, and we could talk hours for that, but we're not. More. So how about this, man? Let's talk. We're gonna do a couple of top 10s here. How about that?
Okay,
let's do some villains. We'll start off with just non-King, and then we'll go to King. How's that sound?
All right.
So I'd say my number one horror villain, non-King, you already know. It's Freddy Krueger. I've already mentioned why. Enough said. What about you?
I don't know if it's my number one. I'd have to actually sit down and try to come up with a more specific list. But lists with me, I get too deep into it, and then, I don't know, I start questioning it.
All right.
But I definitely want to put probably closer to number 10 than number 1, so we'll just put it in the middle to start. But Pumpkinhead.
Ooh, all right,
Pumpkinhead's interesting just because it's not your run-of-the-mill slasher by any means, and it's not your average alien invasion, and it's not really how people do demons. It's its own kind of thing, and I like that about it. It's more original than most.
It was, and they got out there with all them sequels, but like,
I mean,
they were still fun. They turned to sci-fi classics.
I feel like very few, or there probably isn't a single franchise that doesn't get silly after a while, because this is,
True. All right, so I'll just continue down. I'll do my top 10, and you just throw out your extras, I guess.
All right, so yeah, because I'm not,
My number 2 would be The Thing. I mean, it's terrifying. It can be anyone or anything. It's
how do you feel about
transformations are terrifying.
How you feel about the older ones? Was the Thing from Outer Space or whatever it's called?
I saw it twice. I saw it as a kid, and I didn't really remember it much, and so I sat and watched it a few years ago. And I'm gonna tell you, I'm not a fan. I'm just kind of bored with it.
So what
And
about the most?
I do watch a lot of old horror, so like that's not really a problem with me usually. But I just
Yeah.
wasn't into it. Of course, the classic Kurt Russell one, man. That's not gonna be beat.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
But the prequel
Mhm.
was fire. I love it. They can keep it coming. If they can figure out how to do a sequel, I'm not gonna be mad.
I mean, you can always do a sequel of that. It's more of a conceptual thing where you can kind of put that anywhere and run with
Yeah,
it.
That's a creature from outer space. How do you know there's not another one? Oh, you killed that one. Cool. Now another
Yeah,
one
like
may
there's
hit
a-
in
there may be
a
an-
futuristic time.
There's an entire species, and we're just now figuring it out. Because, I mean, also, in a similar kind of conceptual thing that could work anywhere at any time. But for some reason, it hasn't been remade, and that's The Blob.
Oh, it was supposed to. Sam Jackson was like the lead role for it and everything, and it just got cut, man. It got like passed around, and it got cut. That's what I heard.
I don't know if
may
that-
not be
I don't know
right.
if that. I don't know if that counts as a villain or not, but it's just
I mean, it's
similar to The Thing. It's like
Look,
it's
a creature feature. The creature's the villain.
All
Them's the roles. I didn't make them.
all right. Then I would also include the birds.
Oh, the birds. Yeah, they're terrifying. So are heights like the villain in Vertigo?
That's what I was
All right,
saying.
we're getting too deep.
We're just too
Getting too deep.
too
Okay.
Hitchcock.
Get back on topic. Number 3, I gotta go Pazuzu.
Oh yeah, The Exorcist. That's
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Not a lot of people just don't know that that's the demon's
yeah.
name.
That's just
But
Pazuzu.
yeah, it's Pazuzu, and he's kind of terrifying.
Yeah. In all the sequels, it works. So.
Yeah, and you know why he's terrifying. Yeah. After Pazuzu, people ain't gonna agree with this one. I gotta go the Leprechaun, man. I love the Leprechaun. He's
Warwick Davis is he's a treasure.
yeah, guys. Professor Flintwick. He was an evil little shit at one point.
He also played Willow. You remember Willow?
Yeah. Who doesn't? We're 90s kids.
Yeah, that was made in the 80s. Anyway,
We're still 90s kids. We watched Willow. Alright, so after Leprechaun, I gotta go Candyman. He's just a... Like, I love that movie, but that's terrifying. You can just...
like
fill your throat with bees, and then he's got the hook, and like, it's just terrifying, man.
he's also just good, just standing there and being menacing in his weird little way.
Giving the stank eye.
Yeah, it's just some kind of whatever presence that actor has is just.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, didn't he play Death in Final Destination?
He wasn't. He was just the mortician, but
Oh.
he was kind of the warning before. Like
Yeah.
he's the expert on the villain because he's.
Alright, so... after Candyman, I got... Sorry, lost it here. Oh, Leatherface. Yeah,
Leatherface.
he wears people's faces, chases you around with a chainsaw, and eats people. That is horrifying. I'm not trying to deal with that.
And I mean, my personal opinion on Leatherface is that franchise, much like with The Hills Have Eyes, it's the entire family. It's not just the one that gets all the attention. Leatherface gets the attention because he was the
He's
most
got that
rambunctious in
chainsaw.
the first one. Yeah.
But yeah, no.
But the other ones is just as terrifying once you realize what's going on. Like that final scene in the first one when they're just in the house. Just
And we're talking Texas Chainsaw for a minute. Let's talk about how nasty it was in the remake with the one with Jessica Biel.
mm-hmm.
Like when they went into that like little shop and they had all them flies on the meat in the deli case. Come on, man, that's disgusting.
I mean,
No one wants to see that.
just the whole.
It just really set the mood for yeah, this town's fucked up.
I mean, we could talk about that for a minute. Just where's the line between this is gross enough that highlights and adds emphasis to the actual terrifying shit versus y'all is just being nasty.
Oh,
Like-
you mean the one that the Exorcist tap danced on with the pea soup?
Yeah. Then I mean, there's we could go all the way to Green Inferno. Like,
Oh, watch it. It's great. All right.
so I'm sure we'll touch on that subject of like where's the line, because that's an interesting conversation to be had. But we'll
do that in the
continue
future.
with the list.
Yeah. So number 7, Damien, like the creepy kid. I mean, there's others, but he is the creepy kid from The Omen. If you don't know.
Yeah, personally, I think it's after the second one I didn't really care anymore.
I completely understand.
But and it really like halfway through the second one, I really kind of stopped
The
caring.
first one's where he's like the most menacing.
Yeah, just because he's a child and
Yeah, exactly. He's not the kid anymore. He's growing up, and it's not as terrible.
yeah, like now it's just whatever. But
So yeah, you gotta have him on the list. Then I gotta go with the Creeper, man. Like
oh yeah, Jeepers Creepers super underrated. Like
Creatures Features really kind of fell out for a while, and then Jeepers Creepers came out, and
I think
kinda brought it back.
for a while there, everyone was focused on possessions and like
Or
haunted
psychological.
houses, and yeah, like there was a lot more psychological stuff going on. Kind of overlapped with the whole analog horror of the found footage type thing, and because I mean Cloverfield was technically a creature feature.
True.
But it did
Aliens.
fall under the analog, found footage style. And so it kind of got shoehorned into, well, there's just another one of those. And while people can argue over, like, the first Paranormal Activity, all the sequels, to me, are kind of pointless because that kind of thing really only works the once. Which is why no one cared about Blair Witch Project a year after that one came out. Like, that
That's
first
true.
year, Blair Witch Project was the
Blew
biggest
up.
deal in the world. And then everyone's like, well, because you can only really pull that off the one time. And then it's like, whatever.
You just showed us this. I don't need to see it again.
Yeah. But,
Well, since we were really talking creature features there, that kind of leads me to number 9, the Xenomorph Queen from Alien. I know it really turned into
Aliens.
more of a sci-fi action franchise.
I was going to
but
say Aliens does
it
kind of
was a
stand on
horror.
that cusp. It's
It
definitely
was a-
horror.
The first one, it was a horror film, and the Xenomorph was terrifying, and well, with the exception of number 3, which we don't really talk about, the aliens just got more terrifying.
More menacing.
Yeah, they could do more. It was more of a problem. It was scarier to deal with. But granted, horror wise, the first one really
Yeah, it was a classic
the only
horror
one,
film.
in my opinion. It was like a real horror.
Yeah, it definitely does stand on the cusp
now-
between sci-fi and horror, but so does Predator.
Covenant's bringing it, kind of getting back to that vibe. But yeah, Alien. I gotta go with the Xenomorph Queen, man. Pretty terrifying creature there.
I would just like to mention, since we are mentioning creature features, let's just go ahead and throw out the classics of Godzilla, King Kong,
Oh yeah,
all the kaiju.
I know they've
style.
turned into like action films now, but no, those were
Those
were
were meant
horror.
to be horror films.
Like that's
Yeah.
terrifying.
And then, of course, similar things like Anaconda, which
Yeah.
gets a lot of shit, and I understand why. Same thing with Lake Placid.
Oh, like they're both great.
But there was definitely a moment in time where horror had a really weird thing going on, because there was also Eight-Legged Freaks, where they were trying to combine comedy of that era, the late 90s, early 2000s
Yeah.
style comedy, with the creature feature, because horror wasn't doing that great if you weren't already an established
That's
thing.
true.
But that's some some history of horror for you there.
All right. Well, to round out my list, someone we've talked about quite a bit, to be honest. Ghostface. I mean,
Ghostface, yeah. We like screaming
your
around here,
homie
people.
is trying to kill you, and you didn't even know.
Or
it.
your boyfriend and
Yeah, like someone you know is trying, or
This
people you know are trying to kill you, and you have no idea who.
It was in the first one. It's so messed up that like this dude literally just got done killing your friend, and now you're having sex with him, and then like 5 minutes later you find out he's the killer. Like that's some psychological tormenting at like.
And I gotta appreciate Ghostface because first movie, opening scene, when he's calling Drew Barrymore and he asks her her favorite scary movie and he quizzes her about it and she says Jason Voorhees is the killer and he just
calls her on
shits
that
her,
shit.
bro, because it's not.
It's the mom.
Yep, gotta appreciate him. Called her out on it, and I feel like if she'd have got it right, she might have lived. We wouldn't have even had a franchise. He'd have just retired.
And I mean, yeah, like exactly. We can appreciate the comedy within horror because like we mentioned, it is really attention relief because you can only crank the horror up to a certain point before, like your audience is gonna get burnt out. Like you gotta have those spots to rest, and you gotta care enough about the characters and whatever plot you got going on to continue watching between the actual action scenes and actual horror scary bits. But one of the best ways to endear your audience to your characters is make them a little bit funny, give them a personality of like that they would care to hang out with because you're going to be spending this
Make them an
hour or
actual
2
person.
hours with them. Yeah.
Alright, well, we talked about a lot of non-King villains here, so let's be real. King's the king. Let's talk about his, and we're going to start with the best one.
Randall Flagg. Yeah, everyone wants to go ahead and say Pennywise because Pennywise the Dancing Clown is probably his most famous creation at this point, and of course, he's number 2 on both of our lists anyways. So Pennywise is great, but Randall Flagg is not only the most consistent King villain as far as he shows up the most in the multiverse, and
he's a menace to everybody.
Yeah, he causes problems, and he also happens to be the other big book villain right next to Pennywise. Stephen King's 2 largest works are It and The Stand, and so they coincide with Pennywise and Flagg. So obviously those 2 are gonna be to hold a book that big and hold the attention of so many fans for so long in such a broad book. Like, yeah, you have to be a good villain, and they're very like detailed and interesting once you get down to it. But Flagg is definitely number 1 just because of where he goes.
Absolutely. So we done dropped our 1s and 2 here for Flagg and Pennywise, but the description of Flagg really leads really well into my number 3, Leland Gaunt, man. The guy's just a menace to society. Just terrorizes the town. And he comes off as he's just so nice, just a really nice guy at first, and then just with just snap of a finger, just the rudest, sickest, vilest man ever. Yeah, he's terrifying.
So I'm gonna steal your thunder on the next one then, since you mentioned being able to go from the nicest, sweetest person to the vilest human being ever. So number 3 and or 4 or wherever we are now, it's gonna be Annie Wilkes.
Not quite. She's number 5 for me.
Well, she fits the description though.
She absolutely does. Annie is a great villain. I mean, she's super. She's his caretaker. she loves him. She wants to take care of him. You know, is trying to heal him. And then just he doesn't play ball, and like the hobbling scene. No said.
All right. So who was your number 3 since
It was 4.
or
Get
4?
it right.
Who's your number 4?
Kurt
since-
Barlow.
Oh,
And
Kurt Barlow.
He wasn't even the one to me that was terrifying. He is, but he's the master vampire there. He's the one creating all of them, but it's really Danny Glade that was terrifying. But no, Kurt Barlow is a problem.
Mm-hmm.
He's a great villain.
We'll be getting back to him in a minute.
Oh yeah, you will hear about him.
And for me, if you're going to make a list like this, at the top of the list, not necessarily number 1 or 2 or even 3, but definitely in the top 5, has to be the Big Red Man, the Crimson King.
Now, see, I've not read near as much King as you have.
So you haven't met him yet.
I have not met the Crimson King at all because I've never finished the Dark Tower. I stopped reading so we could do this.
You haven't read Insomnia.
I've not read Insomnia yet. So, no, I don't know about the Crimson King. I know of him from you from over the years.
Well,
But
speaking of Insomnia, I would also like to add to this list. And this is going to sound weird to a lot of people that's not familiar with Insomnia, but the Bald Little Doctors.
yeah, it sounds weird.
Yeah, it's quite a menacing situation and is based on the Greek fates, so you can kind of figure out where that may go if you know the subject I'm talking about. But what about death? Because in a lot of Stephen King books, and a lot of other books for that matter, death is kind of framed as a villain. But then again,
I mean, that's just...
where I'm taking this is it's part of the theme of Insomnia, but it also takes me back to one of my favorite Stephen King books, and we've already mentioned it here, but like, who exactly is the villain in Pet Sematary?
Grief.
Yeah,
Yes,
because I'm going to say it's not death, because death is kind of seen as a more of a indifferent situation, but like, you know, it hurts like a villain, but it's actually not. And
So my personal opinion would be that themes such as death and grief, while you can write them as the villain of this story, they're not a true villain. It's a part of life, and that's one thing that makes King so great, is he can write parts of life, just, you know, something everyone deals with, as the villain, when that's not really a villain. It's just a crappy thing that you have to deal with.
I can see that. It's just with, like, I've read a lot of different things, and so I've seen a lot of different takes on basically what you just said. But within horror, oftentimes, because I mean, what are people really running from when they're running away from Ghostface?
They're running from death.
They're running from death.
That's what. But that, if we're going there, then that's what every villain. They're not the villain. They're
Not
not the real
necessarily.
villain. The death that comes with them.
Because one we haven't mentioned here is Jigsaw. Like, he's not out to really kill anyone.
No, he's more sadistic. He wants you to survive it and just deal with that the rest of your life. No, thank you.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm saying. Like, in a lot of cases, it's not really the, you know, goal of the killer isn't necessarily just to kill. Because, like, in a lot of the Scream movies, we keep going back to that. For example, have you seen, like, the more recent ones?
No, I've seen 4 and 5 once each, and I could not tell you a thing about them, to be honest with you. I can't remember them.
They're more focused on gaining the fame that Sidney and the killers from the first movie got, and so it's kind of like
They're trying to maim you.
Like, they don't really want to kill; they just want to be
Attention.
famous. And Yeah, and like that's an interesting place to take horror, in my opinion. And so let's try to wrap this list up a little bit.
Yeah. We'll go through them a little quicker here. I'll probably just ditch the list.
Well, I mean, go ahead. Okay, no, that works.
You got to go with TikTok Man. He was one of the mini villains, I guess you would consider him, a mini boss for the Quartet and Wastelands.
Yeah, it's the Wastelands. Well, if we're going to talk about the Wastelands, let's talk about the real villain in Wastelands. The real pain. Blaine the Train.
Blaine the Train. Man, Blaine's great. He's such a fun character to read through. Mm-hmm. I mean, he just likes riddles.
I just like the stylized way that he speaks on the page, the way it's written. Always interested me. And it makes him really stand out as a character.
I think one thing that really made him stand out and kind of a style, if you will, with him is everything's kind of an older feel to it when you're reading. You get old school vibes, like old school Western kind of.
I will say
you get that feel while you're reading through, and then as soon as they enter into his train, it's just like, oh, clean. This is super clean, technical, high tech. You know what I'm trying to say.
Well, one thing, I have described the Dark Tower the Dark Tower series to so many people, and one way that I have described it in the past is that reading the Dark Tower, the entire story is just kind of coated with a film of dust, but not like the haunted house kind of dust, but like desert dust.
Yeah.
And there are a few sections of the book that remove them, not from the book, but the whole series, that remove themselves from that kind of dirty feel. And we don't want to get too much into what I'm saying here because there'll be spoilers. But yeah, that part of the story is one of those places where, it just kind of removes itself from that and everything's smoothed out and clean and not as just dusty is really the only word that I can think of to describe it right now.
It's dusty.
But there's just, even in the super high-tech sci-fi fantasy magic craziness that's going on, there's always the feel of these motherfuckers have boots on. They got cowboy hats. There's dirt everywhere.
Yeah, Roland the gunslinger just on this high-tech mono trail. It's weird.
And so other villains.
Man, all right.
Christine.
Ooh, a car. Yeah, and then he did it again, but very differently and from a Buick 8.
Yeah.
And both are great. Both are great. Read them both. Man, but if we're talking King villains though, the bullies.
Oh yeah, all the bullies. Henry Bowers,
bullies
Ace
were
Merrill.
Everyone's villain growing up. It's so relatable, but yes, Ace Merrill for sure. He's one of my favorite villains, reoccurring in several things.
Bully's name in Christine. I can't remember his name right now.
I don't remember. I'm gonna be honest with you. Arnold's kind of a bully.
That is true. Arnie is an asshole.
Yeah, once he gets the car.
Once he gets Christine.
Yeah, he thinks he's hot shit and just runs all over people.
So I feel like we've kind of narrowed the, obviously there's several famous ones that we didn't mention at all. Percy Wetmore should be on here.
Oh, see.
Jack Torrance is one.
Percy Whitmore. Sorry, you hit me on that one. I gotta slow down. Percy Whitmore. While he should probably be the number one because he is the biggest piece of shit in literary history, in my opinion.
It's not really an overstatement.
You don't really think to put him on the list because it's a top 10 list, and you're thinking of your favorites, and you just hate that guy.
Thinking of supernatural.
He can't be in the top 10 of anything. He's garbage.
So yeah, we can mention others like Cujo, Jack Torrance. There's a dozen, but clearly we can narrow it down to Annie.
Oh yeah, Annie.
The Crimson King.
Flag,
Pennywise.
Gaunt.
And Gaunt. And I would say let's take it back to Barlow for a minute, because we're going to be reading through Salem's Lot. That's the first one on my list, and so we should kind of discuss that here for a minute.
Yeah, we have a video coming up pretty soon, actually.
Yeah,
An episode coming up pretty soon.
Let's record it tomorrow.
All right.
But
okay.
But we're gonna be discussing the first 3 chapters. So right now, I figure let's just.
Oh no! We're gonna just do all part 1, aren't we?
Yeah, that's true. We're gonna be doing the Marsden House.
Anyway.
Yeah, it's not much longer than the 3 chapters.
Yeah, if
but
we do it only 3 chapters at a time, it'll take forever.
That's fair. So, but I figure since we're gonna be discussing the first part next time, we'll just kind of. We're both reading it right now. I think we've both read it in the past before. So, what are your general thoughts on Salem's Lot?
Again, so I'm rereading it right now for this, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I haven't read it since I was in like 10th grade, and I loved it. And it was a scary book. Like, I never thought any books were real scary, to be honest. Reading.
Yeah, it's hard
never,
to.
But you can get that scary vibe. All right, like sometimes you have like the little hair standing up on the back of your neck or something.
That's what I was gonna think. I think more like psychological horror works so well is because it is hard in our modern day and age to be spooked physically by a book when you're just sitting there reading it, and I understand that. But a lot of it is about just the vibe, and there are moments when you're reading certain books where you're just bothered.
Yes.
And a lot of that just being bothered is just the fear of, like, if someone touched your shoulder right now, you would be physically scared. But as far as just sitting there reading the book, you're just in the story, you're feeling those emotions. And so it is hard to say you're being scared, but that's why I like the suspense and the thrilling. Those words tend to become synonyms in a way of the horror genre. They're little offshoots.
That's parts of horror.
Yeah. And so, but as far as like the being physically, mortified or like stronger words than just scared, most of that nowadays is reserved for film.
True. So, the thing I take away the most right now, this far into my reread, is that what this book does so well is to instill fear, and when the characters are terrified, the descriptions that they're going through, they're so surreal that it takes you there. Does a great job of that.
And that's one thing that reading through this book and doing this podcast that I would like to highlight is the idea of the suspension of disbelief, where, like, obviously, like, you don't believe in vampires, and on any rational level of thinking, you wouldn't ever consider the fact that there might be a vampire outside your window looking at you.
But if you saw a vampire, you seen a vampire, and that's scary.
Yeah. And so, like, if a book at any point can get you even considering that, then I feel like it's done its job. And Stephen King is one of the best ones at, like, just getting you in that mood to be scared and get you to care about the characters, so you do start trying to go through the emotions with the characters as they're dealing that, and you got that suspension of disbelief going. Then yeah, like, that's the moment that you do start, like, looking over your shoulder, is someone fucking watching me or whatever,
I mean, he can spend an entire page just describing what the character's feeling in a moment, and it's just
it gets chilling.
Terrifying. There's so much to it, but it's so real.
Mm-hmm. And so yeah, there are those various levels of horror. So you got on the psychological level of, they do call it psychological horror, something where it just gets you thinking about conceptual things, and that's where the horror lies, is more on a conceptual level, where you might not be scared in the moment reading this book, but later on, when you're by yourself, laying down, and now you start thinking about that stuff, that's when it's like, oh no, I should know I'm gonna have nightmares, and then
That's when you notice the branches scratching the window.
yeah, and then there's the other level of it works better in movies where it's like jump scares, like you're
You got
actually
the
physically
visual and the music
scared.
behind it. Yeah.
And then there is that in between stage where a lot of books like this one, Salem's Lot, can reach where you do start getting like physically, like your heart starts fucking dumping a little faster than it normally should.
It's tense. It's
Yeah,
very
and you
tense.
start like gripping the book a little harder. Like that's where Salem's Lot lives, and I like books that can actually accomplish that. And so reading this, what do you think about modern day vampires versus these vampires?
Man, so I'm a little split. All right. On one hand, modern day vampires, there's more to them now, and a lot of versions of them, different people's takes on them. They can do more things. They get kind of cooler, you know. Not usually as scary. It's usually more of a oh that's cool thing now. You know,
Turn more fantasy,
actiony,
more fantasy than horror.
But it's cool and I like that. But at the same time, it is like, man, vampires are not like they sparkle now, bro.
They're not as vicious as they used to be.
Yes.
And I mean, there is that. Obviously, you're referencing Twilight versus something like Salem's Lot or the EC
But
Comics version.
Honestly, even Lost Boys wasn't.
I was gonna say it
wasn't
kind of
scary. You know, it was more scary than a lot of modern ones, but
started
that was
with
where it started kind of losing its edge.
Anne Rice and the Interview with a Vampire,
So
Vampire Lestat novels.
So
Like,
boring.
well, I mean, I like the movie, and I
haven't read the
tried
books.
I
I
tried
just
reading the
watched
books
the
a couple
movie.
times, but I've never been really able. But I mean, there's like I know we mentioned Mike from Mike's book reviews. He fucking
loves
likes
them. Yeah.
Anne Rice, those books and everything.
I mean, if you like them, you like them. I mean, everyone likes what they like. I'm not going to judge you for that.
I liked the movie with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise
I
back in the
did
day.
not. Everyone else will seem to love it. I'm just not a fan. It's just
Had a
man.
fire cast though.
Oh, the cast is amazing, dude. Like you got a good cast. I'll watch a movie 4 or 5 times just because the cast is great. If I'm being honest.
All right, so as far as Salem's Lot goes, where you're at now, do you feel like they could? Because I wanted to mention they're remaking the movie apparently.
We'll see.
We'll see where that goes. Obviously, we stand with the striking actors and all that. But as far as remakes coming up, you know, who can tell when something's gonna come out? But
They've been trying to remake this movie for like 8 years now, dude.
yeah, that's fair. But as far as that goes, do you think it would be as effective today without having to change it more than the previous one was? Do you think like a
Absolutely.
straightforward telling would
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I tend to agree with you, but it's an interesting question I thought I'd throw out there.
Yeah, no, I absolutely do, because it was more of a psychological horror, to be honest with you. So, one more thing I'd like to add about Salem's Lot that's great is this was, I believe, really his first book that you didn't get a character, you got a town, and you got to know a town of people. And while nowhere near as in depth as many of his other books, but
Does present a
I love that.
model of his ability to create the lived-in town feel.
it was the beginning of the ensembles for him, and I love that. I love character work, so huge fan of that. If you're a fan of that and you haven't checked this book out, my God, do it.
Yeah, so starting now or whenever you get around, like hopefully you've been seeing our ads and trying to get you to read Salem's Lot with us, but we're going to be starting that analysis on the next episode, starting with part 1. So if you want to,
We'll be dropping it sometime around Halloween.
hopefully on Halloween, but we'll see where we're sitting when we get there. But I hope you're going to be following along with us and delving deep into horror along with us, and we'll be seeing you again. Signing off.